Chapter 1. In Fort Repose, a river town in central Florida, it was said that sending a message by Western Union was the same as broadcasting it over the combined networks. This was not entirely true. It was true that Florence Wetcheck, the manager, gossiped, yet she judiciously classified the personal intelligence that flowed under her plump fingers and maintained a prudent censorship over her tongue. The scandalous and the embarrassing she excised from her conversation. Sprightly, trivial, and harmless items she passed on to friends, thus enhancing her status and relieving the tedium of spinsterhood. If your sister was in trouble and wired for money, the secret was safe with Florence Wetcheck. But if your sister bore a legitimate baby, its sex and weight would soon be known all over town. Florence awoke at 6:30 as always on a Friday in early December. Heavy, stiff, and graceless, she pushed herself out of bed and padded through the living room into the kitchen. She stumbled onto the back porch, opened the screen door a crack, and fumbled for the milk carton on the stoop. Not until she straightened did her china blue eyes begin to discern movement in the hushed gray world around her. A jerky-tailed squirrel darted out on the longest limb of her grapefruit tree. Sir Percy, her enormous yellow cat, rose from his burlap couch behind the hot water heater, arched his back, stretched, and rubbed his shoulders on her flannel robe. The African lovebirds rhythmically swayed, heads pressed together on the swing in their cage. She addressed the lovebirds. "Good morning, Anthony. Good morning, Cleo." Their eyes, spectacularly ringed and white, as if embedded in mint lifesavers, blinked at her. Anthony shook his green and yellow plumage and rasped a greeting. Cleo said nothing. Anthony was adventurous, Cleo timid. On occasion, Anthony grew raucous and irascible, and Florence released him into the limitless freedom outside. But always at dusk, Anthony waited in the Turk's cap or atop the frangipani, eager to fly home. So long as Cleo preferred comfortable and sheltered imprisonment, Anthony would remain a domesticated parrot. That's what they told her when she bought the birds in Miami a month before, and apparently it was true. Florence carried their cage into the kitchen and shook fresh sunflower seeds into the feeder. She filled Sir Percy's bowl with milk, crumpled a bit of wafer for the goldfish in the bowl on the counter. She returned to the living room and fed the angelfish, mollies, guppies, and vivid neons in the aquarium. She noted that the 2 miniature catfish, useful scavengers, were active. She was checking the tank's temperature and its electric filter and heater when the percolator chuckled its call to breakfast. At 7 exactly, Florence switched on the television, turned the knob to Channel 8, Tampa, and sat down to her orange juice and eggs. Her morning routine was unvaried and efficient. The only bad parts of it were cooking for one and eating alone. Yet breakfast was not her loneliest meal, not with Anthony ogling and gabbing, the 6 fat goldfish dancing a dreamy oriental ballet on diaphanous fins, Sir Percy rubbing against her legs under the table, and her cheery friends on the morning show, hired at great expense to inform and entertain her. As soon as she saw Dave's face, Florence could sense whether the news was going to be good or bad. On this morning, Dave looked troubled, and sure enough, when he began to give the news, it was bad. The Russians had sent up another Sputnik, number 23, and something sinister was going on in the Middle East. Sputnik number 23 was the largest yet, according to the Smithsonian Institution, and was radioing continuous and elaborate coded signals. There is reason to believe, Frank said, that Sputniks of this size are equipped to observe the terrain of the earth below. Florence gathered her pink flannel robe closer to her neck. She glanced up apprehensively through the kitchen window. All she saw were hibiscus leaves dripping in the pre-dawn ground fog, and blank gray sky beyond. They had no right to put those Sputniks up there to spy on people. As if it were on his mind also, Frank continued. Senator Haller of the Armed Services Committee yesterday joined others of a Midwest bloc in demanding that the Air Force shoot down Sputniks capable of military espionage if they violate U.S. airspace. The Kremlin has already had something to say about this. Any such action, the Kremlin says, will be regarded the same as an attack on a Soviet vessel or aircraft. The Kremlin pointed out that the United States has traditionally championed the doctrine of freedom of the seas. The same freedom, says the Soviet statement, applies to outer space. The newsman paused, looked up, and half smiled in wry amusement at this complexity. He turned a page on his clipboard. There is a new crisis in the Middle East. A report from Beirut via Cairo says that Syrian tanks of the most Russian design have crossed the Jordanian frontier. This is undoubtedly a threat to Israel. At the same time, Damascus charges that Turkish troops are mobilizing. Florence flipped to Channel 6, Orlando, and country music. She did not understand and could not become interested in the politics of the Middle East. Sputnik seemed a closer and more personal menace. Her best friend, Alice Cooksey, the librarian, claimed to have seen a Sputnik one evening at twilight. If you could see it, then it could see you. She stared up through the window again. No Sputnik. She rinsed the dishes and returned to her bedroom. As she wrestled with her girdle, Florence's thought gravitated to the equally prying behavior of Randy Bragg. She adjusted the Venetian blinds until she could peer out. He was at it again. There he was, brazenly immodest in checked red and black pajamas, sitting on his front steps, knees akimbo, and binoculars pressed to his eyes. Although he was perhaps 75 yards distant, she was certain he stared directly at her, and he could see her through the tilted louvers. She ducked back against the bedroom wall, hands protecting her breasts. Almost every evening for the past 3 weeks, and on a number of mornings, she had caught him at it. Sometimes he was on the piazza, as now, sometimes at a second-floor window, and sometimes high up on the captain's walk. Sometimes he swept the whole of River Road with his glasses, pretending an interest elsewhere, but more often he focused on her bungalow. Randolph Rousey Bragg, a Peeping Tom. It was shocking. Long before Florence's mother moved south and built the brown shingle bungalow, the Braggs had lived in the big house, ungainly and monolithic, with tall Victorian windows and bellying bays and broad brick chimneys. Once it had been the showplace of River Road. Now it appeared shabby and outmodeled compared with the long, low, antiseptic glass citadels of glass, metal, and tinted block constructed by rich northerners who for the last 15 years had been discovering the Timucuan River. Still, the Bragg house was planked and paneled with native cypress and encased in pine clapboard hard as iron that might last another 100 years. Its grove, at this season like a full green cloak flecked with gold, trailed all the way from the backyard to the riverbank, a quarter mile. And she would say this for Randy. His grounds were well kept, bright with poinsettias and bougainvillea, hibiscus, camellias, gardenias, and flame vine. Florence had known Randolph's mother, Gertrude Bragg, well, and old Judge Bragg to speak to. She had watched Randolph graduate from bicycle to jalopy, vanish for a number of years in college and law school, reappear in a convertible, vanish again during the Korean War, and finally come home for good when Judge Bragg and Mrs. Bragg were taken in the same year. Now, here was Randy, one of the best-known and most eligible young men in Timucuan County, even if he did run around with Pistolville girls and drink too much, what was it called that the French called it? A voyeur. It was disgusting. The things that went on in small towns people wouldn't believe. Florence faced the bureau mirror, wondering how much he had seen. Many years ago, a man had told her she looked something like Clara Bow. Thereafter, Florence wore her hair in bangs and didn't worry too much about her chubby figure. The man, an imaginative idealist, had gone to England in 1940, joined the commandos, and got himself killed. She retained only a vague and inexact memory of his caresses, but she could never forget how he compared her to Clara Bow, a movie star. She could still see a resemblance, provided she sucked in her stomach and lifted her chin high enough to erase the fleshy creases in her neck, except her hair was no longer like Clara's. Her hair had thinned and faded to mottled pink. She hurriedly sketched a Clara Bow pout on her lips and finished dressing. When she stepped out of the front door, Florence didn't know whether she should cut Randy dead or give him a piece of her mind. He was still there on the steps, the binoculars in his lap. He waved, grinned, and called across lawn and road, "Morning, Miss Florence!" His black hair was tousled, his teeth white, and he looked boyish, handsome, and inoffensive. "Good morning, Randy," Florence said. Because of the distance, she had to shout, so her voice was not formal and frigid as she had intended. "You look real pretty and chipper today," he yelled. She walked to the carport, head averted as if avoiding a bad odor, her stiff carriage a reprimand, and did not answer. He really was nervy sitting there in those vile pajamas trying to sweet-talk her. All the way to town she kept thinking of Randy. Who would ever guess that he was a deviant with a compulsion to watch women dress and undress? He ought to be arrested. But if she told the sheriff, or anybody, they would only laugh at her. Everybody knew that Randy dated lots of girls, and not all of them virgins. She herself had seen him take Rita Hernandez, that little Minorcan tart from Pistolville, into his house, and no doubt up to his bedroom, since the lights had gone on upstairs and off downstairs. And there had been others, recently a tall blonde who drove her own car, a new Imperial with Ohio plates, into the circular driveway and right up the front steps as if she owned the place and Randy. Nobody would believe that he had found it necessary to absorb his sex at long range through optic nerves and binoculars. Yet it was strange that he had not married. It was strange that he lived alone in that wooden mausoleum. He had even had his office in there, instead of in the professional building like the other lawyers. He was a hermit and a snob and a lover and no better than a pervert. God knows what he did with those girls upstairs. Maybe all he did was make them take off their clothes and put them on again while he watched. She had heard of such things. And yet, she couldn't really make herself believe there was anything basically wrong with Randy. She had voted for him in the primaries and stood up for him at the meetings of the Frangipani Circle when those garden club biddies were pecking him to bits. After all, he was a Bragg and a neighbor, and besides, he obviously needed help and guidance. Randy's age, she knew, was 32. Florence was 47. Between people in their 30s and 40s, there wasn't too wide a gap. Perhaps all he needed, she decided, was a little understanding and tenderness from a mature woman. Randy watched Florence's 10-year-old Chevy diminish and disappear down the tunnel of live oaks that arched River Road. He liked Florence. She might be a gossipy old maid, but she was probably one of the few people on River Road who had voted for him. Now she was acting as if he were a stranger trying to cash a money order without credentials. He wondered why. Maybe she disapproved of Lib McGovern, who had been in and out of the house a good deal in the last few weeks. What Florence needed, he guessed, was the one thing she was unlikely to get: a man. He rose, stretched, and glanced up at the bronze weathercock on the garage steeple. Its beak pointed resolutely northeast. He checked the large, reliable marine barometer and its twin thermometer alongside the front door. Pressure 30.17, up 20 points in 12 hours. Temperature 62. It would be clear and warm, and the bass might start hitting off the dock. He whistled and shouted, "Graff! Hey, Graff!" Leaves rustled under the azalea bed, and a long nose came out, followed by an interminable length of dachshund. Graff, his red coat glistening and tail whipping, bounded up the steps, supple as a seal. "Come on, my short-legged friend," Randy said, and went inside, binoculars swinging from his neck, for his second cup of coffee, the cup with the bourbon in it. Except for the library, lined with his father's law books, and the game room, Randy rarely used the first floor. He had converted one wing of the second floor into an apartment suitable in size to a bachelor and to his own taste. His taste meant living with as little exertion and strain as possible. His wing contained an office, a living room, and a combination bar and kitchen alcove, and a bedroom with a bath. The decor was haphazard, designed for his ease, not a guest's eye. Thus, he slept in an outsized mahogany sleigh bed imported from New England by some remote ancestor, but it was equipped with foam rubber mattress and contour nylon sheets. When in boredom he wasted an evening preparing a full meal for himself, he ate from Staffordshire, bearing the Bragg crest, and was silver from Paul's store and by candlelight. But he laid his place on the formica bar separating living room from efficient kitchen. Now he sat on a stool at this bar, half filled a fat mug with steaming coffee, dropped 2 lumps of sugar into it, and laced it with an inch of bourbon. He sipped his mixture greedily. It warmed him all the way down. Randy didn't remember exactly when he had started taking a drink or two before breakfast. Dan Gunn, his best friend and probably the best medic north of Miami, said it was an unhealthy practice and the hallmark of an alcoholic. Not that Dan had reprimanded him. Dan had just advised him to be careful and not let it become a habit. Randy knew he wasn't an alcoholic because an alcoholic craved liquor. He never craved it. He just drank for pleasure, and the most pleasurable of all drinks was the first one on a crisp winter morning. Besides, when you took it with coffee, that made it a part of breakfast, and therefore not so depraved. He guessed he had started it during the campaign, when he had been forced to load his stomach with fried mullet, hush puppies, barbecued ribs dripping fat, chitlins, roasted oysters gritty with sand, and to wash it all down with warm beer and raw rocket. After such nights, only mellow bourbon could clear his head and launch him on another day. Bourbon had buoyed him during his campaign, and now bourbon mercifully clouded its memory. He could have beaten Porky Logan, certainly, except for one small tactical error. Randy had been making his first speech at Pasco Creek, a cow town in the north end of the county, when someone shouted, "Hey, Randy, where'd you stand on the Supreme Court?" He had known this question must come, but he had not framed the right kind of answer. The moderate, southern, quasi-liberal, semi-segregationalist double talk that would have satisfied everybody except the palmetto scrub wool hats and the loudmouth Kluxers and courthouse whittlers who would vote for Porky anyway, and the Georgia and Alabama riffraff crowding the Minorcans for living space in the shanties and three-room bungalows of Pistolville. The truth was that Randolph Bragg himself was torn by the question, recognizing its dangers and complexities. He had certain convictions. He had served in Korea and Japan, and he knew that the battle for Asia was being lost in counties like Timucuan. He also knew that Pasco Creek had no interest in Asia. He believed integration should start in Florida, but it must begin in the nursery schools and kindergartens and would take a generation. This was all difficult to explain, but he did voice his final conviction, inescapable because of his legal heritage and training, and the oaths he had taken as a voter and a soldier. He said, "I believe in the Constitution of the United States." All of it. There had been snickers and snorts from the rim of the crowd, and his listeners, except for the reporters from Tampa, Orlando, and the County Weekly, had drifted away. In later speeches elsewhere, he attempted to explain his position, but it was hopeless. Behind his back, he was called a fool and a traitor to his state and race. Randolph Rousey Bragg, whose great-grandfather had been a United States Senator, whose grandfather had been chosen by President Wilson to represent his country as Minister Plenipotentiary and Envoy Extraordinary in the time of war, whose father had been elected, without opposition, to half a dozen offices. Randolph was beaten 5-1 in the Democratic primaries for nomination to the state legislature. It was worse than defeat. It was humiliation, and Randy knew he could never run for public office again. He refilled his mug, this time with more bourbon than coffee, and Missouri, his maid, shuffled in the hallway and knocked. He called, "Come in, Mizzou." Missouri opened the door, pushing a vacuum cleaner and carrying a pail filled with cans, bottles, and rags. Missouri was the wife of Two-Tone Henry, neighbor as well as maid. She was 6 inches shorter than Two-Tone, who was just Randy's height, 5'11", but Two-Tone claimed she outweighed him by 100 pounds. If this was true, Missouri weighed around 240, but on this morning it seemed to Randy that she had dwindled a bit. "You dieting, Mizzou?" he said. "No, sir, I'm not dieting. I got nerves." Nerves? Missouri had always seemed nerveless, solid and placid as a broad, deeply rooted tree. "Two-Tone been giving you a bad time again?" "No, Two-Tone been behaving. He down on the dock fishing right now." "To tell you the truth, Mr. Randy, it's Mrs. McGovern. She followed me around with white gloves." Missouri worked 2 hours each morning for Randy, and the rest of the day for the McGoverns, who lived half a mile closer to town. The McGoverns were the W. Foxworth McGoverns, the Central Tool and Plate McGoverns, formerly of Cleveland, and the parents of Lib McGovern, whose proper name was Elizabeth. "What do you mean, Mizzou?" Randy asked, fascinated. "After I dust, she followed me around with white gloves to see has I dusted. I know I cleans clean, Mr. Randy. You sure do, Mizzou. Missouri plugged in the vacuum cleaner, started it, and then shut it off. She had more on her mind. That ain't all. You been in that house, Mr. Randy. You ever seen so many ashtrays? What's wrong with ashtrays? She don't allow no ashes in 'em. That poor Mr. McGovern, he has to smoke his cigars outside. Then there was that roach, big roach in the silver drawer. Mrs. McGovern opened that drawer yesterday, and she saw that roach and screeched like she'd been hit by a scorpion. She made me go through every drawer in the kitchen and dining room and put down fresh paper. Was that roach sent me to Dr. Gunn yesterday. Mrs. McGovern, she can't bide bugs or little green lizards, and she won't go outside after dark for fear of snakes. I don't think the McGovern's going to be with us much longer, Mr. Randy, because what's Florida except bugs and lizards and snakes? I think they leave around May when bug season starts good. But Miss McGovern, she won't want to leave. She's stuck on you. What makes you think so? Missouri smiled. Questions she asked, like what you eats for breakfast. Missouri glanced at the decanter on the bar. And who cooks for you? And does you have other girls? Randy changed the subject. You say you went to see Dr. Gunn. What'd he say? Doctor says I'm a complicated case. Says I got high blood on account of I'm heavy. He says it's good I'm losing weight because that lowers the high blood. But fretting about Mrs. McGovern white gloving me is the wrong way to do it. He says quit eating grits, eat greens. Quit pork, eat fish. And he gives me tranquil pills to take, one each day before I go to work for Mrs. McGovern. You do that, Mizzou, Randy said, and carrying his mug, walked out onto the screen upstairs porch overlooking the grove and river. He then climbed the narrow ship's ladder that led to the captain's walk, a rectangle 16 by 18 feet, stoutly planked and railed on the slate roof. Reputedly, this was the highest spot in Timucuan County. From it, he could see all the riverfront estates, docks, and boats, and all of the town of Fort Repose, 3 miles downstream, held in a crook of sun-flecked silver where the Timucuan joined the broader St. John's. This was his town, or had been. In 1838, during the Seminole Wars, a Lieutenant Randolph Rousey Peyton, U.S.N., a Virginian, had been dispatched to this river junction with a force of 18 Marines and 2 small brass cannon. Lieutenant Peyton journeyed south from Cow's Ford, its name patriotically changed to Jacksonville, by longboat. His orders came from General Clinch, were to throttle the Indian communications on the rivers, thus protecting the flank of the troops moving down the east coast from St. Augustine. Lieutenant Peyton built a blockhouse of palm logs on the point, his guns covering the channel. In 2 years, except during one relief expedition overland to New Smyrna, he fought no battles or skirmishes. But he shot game and caught fish for the garrison pot and studied botany and the culture of citrus. The balmy weather and idyllic life, described in a log now in a teak chest in Randy Bragg's office, inspired the lieutenant to name his outpost Fort Repose. When the war subsided, the fort was decommissioned and Lieutenant Peyton was assigned to sea duty. 4 years later, he returned to Fort Repose with a wife, a daughter, and a grant from the government for 100 acres. He had picked this precise spot for his homestead because it was the highest ground in the area, with a steep gradient to the river, ideal for planting the oranges just imported from Spain and the Far East. Peyton's original house had burned. The present house had been built by his son-in-law, the first Marcus Bragg, a native of Philadelphia and a lawyer eventually sent to the Senate. The captain's walk had been added for the aging Lieutenant Peyton, so that with his brass spyglass he could observe what happened at the junction of the rivers. Now the Bragg holdings had dwindled to 36 acres, but 30 were planted in prime citrus, navels, mandarins, valencias, and temples, all tended and sold in season by the county cooperative. Each year, Randy received checks totaling $8,000 to $10,000 from the cooperative. Half went to his older brother Mark, an Air Force colonel stationed at Offutt Field, headquarters of the Strategic Air Command near Omaha. With his share, plus dividends from a trust established by his father, and an occasional fees as an attorney, Randy lived comfortably. Since he drove a new car and paid his bills promptly, the tradespeople of Fort Repose thought him well-to-do. The rich newcomers classed him with the genteel poor. Randy heard music below and knew that Missouri had started his record player and therefore was waxing the floor. Missouri's method was to spread the wax, kick off her shoes, wrap her feet in rags, and then polish by dancing. This was probably as efficient and certainly more fun than using the electric waxer. He dropped into a deck chair and focused his binoculars on Preacher Henry's place, looking for that damn bird in the hammock of pines, palmettos, and scrub oak. The Henrys had lived here as long as the Braggs, for the original Henry had come as a slave and manservant to Lieutenant Peyton. Now the Henrys owned a 4-acre enclave at the east boundary of the Bragg Groves. Preacher Henry's father had bought it from Randolph's grandfather for $50 an acre long before the first boom, when land was valued only for what it grew. Preacher was hitching his mule, Balaam, the last mule in Timucuan County so far as anyone knew, to the disc. In this month, Preacher harrowed his yam and corn for planting, while his wife, Hannah, picked and sold tomatoes and put up kumquat preserves. He ought to go down and talk to Preacher about that damn bird, Randy thought. If anyone was likely to observe and recognize a Carolina parakeet floating around, it was Preacher, because Preacher knew all the birds and their calls and habits. He shifted his glasses to focus at the end of the Henry's rickety dock. Two-Tone had 5 bamboo poles out. Two-Tone himself reclined on his side, head resting on his hand, so he could watch the corks without effort. Preacher's younger son, Malachi, who was Randy's yardman, was as unreliable as Two-Tone was no account, was not about. Randy heard the phone ringing in his office. The music stopped, and he knew Missouri was answering. Presently, she called from the piazza, "Mr. Randy, it's for you. It's Western Union." "Tell her I'll be right down," Randy said, and lifted himself out of the deck chair and back down the ladder, wondering who would be sending him a telegram. It wasn't his birthday. If something important happened, people phoned. Unless... He remembered that the Air Force sent telegrams when a man was hurt or killed. But it couldn't be Mark, because for 2 years Mark had been flying a desk. Still, Mark would get in his flying time each month, if possible, for the extra pay. He took the phone from Missouri's hand and braced himself. "Yes," he said. "I have a telegram. Randy, it's really a cable from San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's signed by Mark. It's really very peculiar." Randy let out his breath, relieved. If Mark had sent the message, then Mark was all right. A man can't pick his relatives, only his friends, but Mark had always been Randy's friend, as well as his brother. "What's the message say?" "Well, I'll read it to you," Florence said, "and then if you want me to read it again, I'll be glad to. It says, 'Urgent you meet me at Base Ops McCoy noon today. Helen and children fly into Orlando tonight. Alas, Babylon.'" Florence paused. "That's what it says. Alas, Babylon. Do you want me to repeat the whole thing for you, Randy?" "No, thanks." "I wonder what alas, Babylon means. Isn't it out of the Bible?" "I don't know. I guess so." He knew very well what it meant. He felt sick inside. "There's something else, Randy." "Yes?" "Oh, it's nothing. I'll tell you about it next time I see you, and I hope it's not in those loud pajamas. Goodbye, Randy. You're sure you have the message?" "I'm sure," he said, hung up, and dropped into the swivel chair. Alas, Babylon was a private, family signal. When they were boys, he and Mark used to sneak up to the back of the First Afro-Repose Baptist Church on Sunday nights to hear Preacher Henry calling down hellfire and damnation on the sinners in the big cities. Preacher Henry always took his text out of the Revelation of St. John. It seemed that he ended every lurid verse with, "Alas, Babylon," in a voice so resonant you could feel it if you rested your fingertips gently on the warped pine boards of the church. Randy and Mark would crouch under the rear window behind the pulpit, fascinated and wide-eyed, while Preacher Henry described the Babylonian revels, including fornication. Sometimes Preacher Henry made Babylon sound like Miami, and sometimes like Tampa, for he condemned not only fornication, he read the word right out of the Bible, but also horse racing and the dog tracks. Randy could hear him yet. "And I'm telling you right now, all wife swappers, whiskey drinkers, and crap shooters are going to get it. And all them who come out of those sin palaces on the beach, whether they be called hotels or motels, wearing minks and jewels and not much else, they is going to get it. And them fast steppers and Cadillacs and yaller roadsters, they is going to get it. And just like it says here in the good book, that great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, that great city was burned off the face of the earth in an hour. Just 1 hour. Alas, Babylon. Either Preacher Henry was too old, or the Afro-Repose congregation had tired of his scolding and awful prophecies, for he no longer preached except on those Sundays when Afro-Repose's new minister, a light-skinned college graduate, was out of town. Randy and Mark never forgot Preacher Henry's thundering, and from it they borrowed their private synonym for disaster, real or comic, past or future. If one fell off the dock, or lost all his cash at poker, or failed to make time with a promising Pistolville piece, or announced that hurricane or freeze was on the way, the other commiserated with, alas, Babylon. But in this telegram it had a very special and exact meaning. Mark had secured leave at Christmas last season and flown down with Helen and the 2 children, Ben Franklin and Peyton, for a week. On their last evening at Fort Repose, after the others were in bed, Mark and Randy had sat here, in his office, peering into the bourbon decanter and the deep anxieties of their hearts, trying to divine the future. Christmas had been a time of troubles, a time of confusions at home and tensions abroad, but in his whole life, Randy could not recall no other sort of time. There had always been depression, or war, or threat of war. Mark, who was in SAC intelligence, had rolled the old-fashioned globe 3 feet through from its place in the window bay so that the desk lamp shone on it. It was a globe purchased by their grandfather, the diplomat, before the First World War. So the countries, some with unfamiliar names, seemed oddly scrambled. The continents and seas were the same, which was all that mattered. As Mark talked, his face became grave, almost gaunt, and his index finger traced great circle routes across the cracking surface, missile and bomber trajectories. He then drew a rough chart with 2 lines that intersected. The line that continued upward after the intersection belonged to the Soviet Union, and the time of the intersection was right then. How did it happen? Randy had asked. Where did we slip? It wasn't a lack of money, Mark had replied. It was a state of mind. Chevrolet mentalities shying away from a spaceship world. Nations are like people. When they grow old and rich and fat, they get conservative. They exhaust their energy trying to keep things the way they are, and that's against nature. Oh, the services were to blame too, maybe even SAC. We designed the most beautiful bombers in the world and built them by the thousands. We improved and modified them each year like new model cars. We couldn't bear the thought that jet bombers themselves might be out of style. Right now, we're in the position of the Federal Navy with its wooden steam frigates up against the Confederate ironclad. It's a state of mind that money alone won't cure. What will? Randy asked. Men. Men like John Erickson to invent a monitor to face the Merrimack. Bold men, audacious men, tenacious men. Impatient, oddball men like Rickover, pounding desks for his atomic sub. Ruthless men who will fire the deadheads and the ass-kissers. Rude men who will tell the unimaginative, business-as-usual, 7-carbon sons of bitches to go take a jump at a galloping goose. Young men, because we've got to be a young country again. If we get that kind of men, we may hack it, if the other side gives us time. Will they? Mark had spun the globe and shrugged. I don't know. If I think the balloon is about to go up, I'm going to send Helen and the kids down here. When a man dies and his children die with him, then he is dead entirely, leaving nothing to show. Do you think they'd be safer here than in Omaha? After all, we've got Jack's Naval Air Complex to the north of us, and Homestead and Miami to the south, and Eglin to the northwest, and MacDill and Tampa to the southwest, and the Missile Test Center at Cape Canaveral to the east, and McCoy in Orlando right at the front door, only 40 miles off. What about fallout? There isn't any place that'll be absolutely safe. With fallout and radiation, it'll be luck. The size and configuration of the weapons, altitude of the fireball, direction of the wind. But I do know Helen and the children won't have much of a chance in Omaha. SAC headquarters has got to be the enemy's #1 target. I'll bet they've programmed 3 5-megaton ICs for Offutt. And since our house is 8 miles from the base, any kind of near miss does it. Mark snapped his fingers, like that. Not that I think it'll do the enemy any good. Command automatically shifts to other combat control centers, and anyway, all our crews know their targets. But they'll hit SAC headquarters hoping for temporary paralysis. A little delay is all they'll need. I'll have to be there at Offutt in the hole, but the least a man can do is give his children a chance to grow up, and I think they'd have a better chance here in Fort Repose than Omaha. So if I see it's coming, and there is time, I'll send Helen and the kids down here, and I'll try to give you a warning so you can get set for it. How? Mark smiled. I won't call up and say, hey, Randy, the Russians are about to attack us. Phones aren't secure, and I don't think my CNC or the air staff would approve. But if you hear Alas Babylon, you'll know that's it. Randy had forgotten none of this talk. A week or so later, thinking about Mark's words, Randy had decided to go into politics. He would start in the state legislature and in a few years be ready to run for Congress. He'd be the kind of leader Mark wanted. It hadn't worked out that way. He couldn't even beat Porky Logan, a gross man whose vote could be bought for $50, who bragged that he had not got beyond the 7th grade, but that he could get more new roads and state money for Timucuan County than any half-baked radical, undoubtedly backed by the burrheads in the NAACP, who didn't even know that the Supreme Court was controlled by Moscow. So Randy's fiasco had been inspired by that night, and now the night bore something worse. He wondered what Mark was doing in Puerto Rico, and why his warning had come from there. It should have come from Washington, or London, or Omaha, or Colorado Springs, rather than San Juan. It was true that SAC had a big base, Ramey, in Puerto Rico, but it was no use guessing. He'd know at noon. Of one thing he was certain. If Mark expected it to come, it would probably come. His brother was no alarmist. Randy sometimes allowed emotions to distort logic, but Mark never did. Mark was capable of calculating odds in war or poker to the final decimal, which was why he was a deputy chief of intelligence at SAC and would soon have his star. Randy knew that there were 1,000 things he should be doing, but he couldn't think of any of them. He became aware of a Roomba rhythm in the living room, and presently Missouri skated into view, feet bundled with waxing cloths, shoulders moving and hips bouncing with elephantine elegance, intent on her polishing. He yelled, "Missouri!" "Yes, sir?" Her forward motion stopped, but her hips continued to wobble and feet shuffle. "Quit that strutting and make up the 3 bedrooms on the front. Colonel Bragg's family will be here tomorrow." "Oh, ain't that nice, just like last year." "No, not like last year. The Colonel's not coming with them, just Mrs. Bragg and Ben Franklin and Peyton." Missouri peered through the door at him. "Mr. Randy, you don't look good. Them telegrams are yellow death. You get bad news or something?" "Ain't nothing happened to Colonel Mark." "No, I'm driving over to McCoy to meet him at noon." "Oh, that's good. How come the children up north get out of school so quick?" "I don't know. I'll dust good and make up the beds and put towels and soaps in the bathrooms just like last year." "Thanks, Mizzou, that's fine." "Caleb's going to be happy to see Ben Franklin," Missouri said. Caleb was Missouri's son and just Ben's age, 13. Last year, Randy had let them take the boat out on the river fishing, just as Randy, as a boy, had fished with Caleb's uncle, Malachi, except that 20 years ago, the boat was a skiff powered by muscle and oars instead of a sleek fiberglass job with a 30-horse kicker. Missouri gathered up her cleaning materials and left Randy alone with his nightmare. He shook his head, but he didn't wake up. The nightmare was real. Slowly, he forced his mind to function. Slowly, he forced himself to imagine the unimaginable. He must make a list of things Helen and the children would need. He recalled that there was nothing stocked in the big kitchen downstairs and the little utility room except some steaks in the freezer and a few canned staples. My God, if there was going to be a war, they'd need stocks of everything. He looked at his watch. He had yet to shave and dress, and he must allow an hour and a half for the drive to McCoy, 10 miles south of Orlando, when you considered the main highways clogged with tourists, and Orlando's infuriating and hopeless traffic tangle on a sunny payday, less than 3 weeks before Christmas. And there might be some delay at the McCoy gate. He decided to give himself 2 hours on the road. Still, he could start the list, and there was one thing he should do right away. Ben Franklin drank a quart of milk a day, and Peyton, his 11-year-old sister, even more. He telephoned Golden Dew Dairy and revised his delivery order drastically upward. This was Randy's first act to meet the emergency, and it was to prove the least useful.